My wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but it turned into a total spectacle. I stood at the altar, looking at my fiancé, when my sister interrupted to show a special surprise on the big screen. Everyone expected a sweet photo montage, but the room went dead silent as a video of her and my groom in bed together started playing. Gasps filled the hall, and my fiancé looked ready to faint. But instead of crying, I simply smiled, grabbed the microphone, and dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming. The sun beamed down through the stained glass windows of the old church. I squeezed Mark's hand, feeling the sweat on his palm against my skin. He offered a nervous smile, but his eyes darted around the room rather than meeting mine. Hundreds of friends and family sat in the pews, waiting for us to exchange our vows. It felt like the perfect tableau of a traditional wedding, but the extreme tension in Mark's grip told a very different story to me. The officiant began reading the opening lines about love and commitment. Just as he took a breath to continue, movement from the front row caught everyone's attention. My sister, Sarah, rose from her seat in the maid of honor spot. She did not look at me or the groom as she walked past the altar. The clicking of her heels echoed in the quiet hall as she approached the large white screen set up to the side of the stage. Confused murmurs rippled through the congregation as they watched Sarah's unexpected detour. She pulled a slender laptop from beneath the skirting of the sweetheart table. With practiced precision, she plugged an HDMI cable into the port. A few people chuckled, assuming this was part of a planned toast or a sentimental slideshow. I stood perfectly still, watching her fingers fly across the keyboard to initiate her unauthorized program, knowing exactly what was about to happen next. The projector hummed to life, casting a bright rectangular light onto the canvas. Audio crackled through the church speakers before the image sharpened into focus. It was not a montage of childhood memories or romantic dates. Instead, the high-definition video showed a bedroom I recognized immediately as my own guest room. On screen, Mark and Sarah were tangled together in the sheets, clearly engaged in an act that shattered the sanctity of this wedding day. A collective intake of breath sucked the air right out of the room. The graphic nature of the video left absolutely nothing to the imagination. Mark's hand went limp in mine before he yanked it away as if burned. He spun around to face the screen, his jaw dropping open in horror. The footage continued to play, complete with audio that echoed off the vaulted ceilings, making it impossible for anyone to ignore the betrayal. In the front row, my mother looked as though she had been struck physically. She clamped both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes darted frantically from the explicit video to Sarah, and then to me standing alone at the altar. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her professionally done makeup. The betrayal was double-sided, coming from both her future son-in-law and her own daughter. Panic finally overtook Mark's initial shock, and he lunged toward the AV equipment. He shouted for Sarah to turn it off, desperate to salvage his reputation. But before he could reach the laptop, a large figure stepped into his path. His best man, whom I had spoken to earlier that week, stood firm like a bouncer. Mark bounced off his chest, unable to get past the wall of muscle protecting the screen. Sarah did not flinch at the chaos erupting around her. She simply stepped back from the table and leaned against the wall. A satisfied smirk played on her lips as she watched Mark struggle. She crossed her arms over her chest, seemingly proud of the destruction she had caused. She believed she had ruined my day and stolen my groom in one fell swoop, unaware that her victory was an illusion. I reached out and removed the wireless microphone from the stand next to the officiant. The metal felt cool and heavy in my hand. I tapped the head of the mic twice, producing a loud thumping sound that boomed through the speakers. The feedback screeched briefly, cutting through the murmurs and the audio from the video. It was time to take control of the narrative and end the charade. The sharp noise of the microphone worked instantly. Every head in the church swiveled back toward the altar. The video continued to play in the background, but the guests were now fixated on me. They waited with bated breath, expecting a meltdown or a flood of tears. Instead, I stood tall, facing the crowd with a composure that seemed to confuse them even more than the video itself. I took a moment to smooth the silk fabric of my gown over my hips. Once I was ready, I locked eyes with the man I was supposed to marry. Mark was trembling, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking his collar. He looked pleadingly at me, perhaps hoping for forgiveness or a quick exit from this nightmare. I offered him neither, staring him down until he was forced to look away in shame. I raised the microphone to my lips and addressed the stunned congregation. My voice remained steady and devoid of the hysteria they anticipated. I asked everyone to please take their seats and settle down. There was still business to attend to, and I wasn't finished yet. The authority in my tone made them comply immediately, and the room grew quiet enough to hear a pin drop. With my free hand, I reached into the dense arrangement of white roses I was holding. Concealed within the stems was a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out and held it high above my head for everyone to see. It was heavy with documents, sealing the fate of the man standing a few feet away from me. The room waited to see what other secrets were about to spill out. I looked Mark dead in the eye and spoke into the microphone. I stood calmly amidst the chaos, revealing to the shocked guests that I had discovered their affair months ago and had been waiting for this exact moment. I explained that I knew about every hotel visit and every secret meeting. This was not a surprise to me. It was the finale of a long con I had orchestrated. Mark's face turned a deep shade of crimson as he realized the depth of my knowledge. He opened his mouth to shout, waving his hands in a desperate attempt to silence me. But without a microphone, his voice was nothing more than a faint squeak against the amplified sound system. I continued speaking, letting his futile protests fade into the background noise, ensuring everyone heard my side of the story. I walked over to the front pew and handed the heavy envelope to my father. He took it with shaking hands and tore open the seal. Inside were stacks of printed screenshots, bank statements, and travel itineraries. He pulled out a sheet, his eyes scanning the explicit text messages exchanged between Mark and Sarah. His face hardened as the physical proof of their deception settled in his hands. I turned my attention back to my sister, who was no longer smirking. I pointed a finger toward the back of the church where the catering staff had gathered. There were far more servers than necessary for a wedding of this size. Sarah squinted, trying to understand why I was drawing attention to the help. Her confusion grew as the staff members began to move in a coordinated fashion. 2 large men in dark suits emerged from the group of caterers and marched up the aisle. They were not servers. They were private security I had hired weeks ago. They stepped onto the altar and flanked Mark on either side. Before he could resist, they took him by the arms. They firmly escorted him away from the podium and down the stairs, marching him toward the exit. With the groom being removed from the premises, I turned to the man standing behind the pulpit. David, our officiant, had watched the entire scene unfold with a neutral expression. I caught his eye and gave a distinct, single nod. He understood the signal immediately. It was time to drop the final curtain on this theatrical performance and reveal the last piece of the puzzle to the crowd. David unzipped the heavy ceremonial robe that gave him the appearance of a clergyman. He let the fabric fall to the floor, stepping out of it to reveal a stylish, casual suit underneath. The guests gasped again, confused by his sudden change in attire. He looked less like a priest and more like a man ready for a cocktail party. The solemnity of the religious ceremony evaporated in an instant. I addressed the crowd one last time to clear up the confusion about the man standing next to me. I announced the officiant was an actor, meaning the marriage was fake. There were no legal documents signed, and no vows were binding. David was a local theater performer I had employed to play the part of a priest. Mark wasn't just dumped, he was never married to begin with. I looked toward the back doors where Mark was struggling against the security guards. Into the microphone, I thanked my ex for funding the party and left him with the bill. Every flower, every plate of food, and every bottle of champagne had been charged to his credit cards. He had paid for his own public humiliation, and the non-refundable deposits ensured he couldn't get a cent back. I passed the microphone to David, who took it with a polite bow. There was nothing left for me to say. I stepped down from the altar and began my walk down the center aisle. I moved with confidence, my head held high and my shoulders back. The guests parted ways, staring in awe as I made my exit as a free woman. As I reached the heavy oak doors, I saw the venue manager waiting with a clipboard. He intercepted Mark near the entrance and thrust the final invoice into his chest. Mark looked down at the paper, his face draining of color as he saw the total. I didn't stop to watch him weep. I stepped out into the fresh air and climbed into the luxury sedan waiting at the curb. The driver pulled away from the curb, putting distance between me and the wreckage of my relationship. Through the rear window, I could see the church receding into the distance. Inside, I knew the staff was already cutting the cake and popping the champagne. My guests would enjoy a premium feast on Mark's dime while I started my new life. It was the sweetest revenge I could have tasted.